Well, thank you. I actually have to start with a little testimonial. I'm a clinician and I'm an investigator, and I've worked with individuals with autism in many countries. And I have to say that the history of this field has been a history that has been driven by parents everywhere that I've worked in. Allison and the many parents who are here who represent the Autism Science Foundation, I have to say that you have been inspirational to us all. You have shown through your tenacity that everything is possible. It just takes time, and sometimes it's quite painful. But we can get there. Thank you. Thank you for all the work that you've done. So my question is, do we finally have an autism diagnostic biomarker? And here is the answer. We're closer than we've been before, but we're not quite there. A biomarker is a measurement. Is a measurement that captures the essence of a condition. It's objectified, it's quantitative, and is supposed to help us really breach the huge gap that exists between some constitutional vulnerabilities and the way that the condition is defined. Well, I'm here to talk about a candidate biomarker that is something quite prosaic. I'm talking about a behavior that all of us engage most of our lives as we look into people's eyes. And how does behavior help us understand development, and maybe, just maybe, can help us also address the huge public health challenge that autism really is. So going from a behavior to seeking community viable solutions. I have so many people to thank. I have the children and the families over the course of the years, my years at Yale and my years now in Atlanta. I have some very special colleagues, and I have the grant-making agency, some of whom are right here, so thank you. I would also like to celebrate this happy birthday. I think this is a very special foundation, and congratulations to those who are here sitting around those tables who really deserve all of our credit. Autism has been a personal journey for me. I started in this field in the mid-'80s, and I started living and working in a residential unit for adults with autism. These were profoundly disabled individuals. These are individuals who had lived all of their lives in long-stay hospitals and in institutions. They had very severe forms of the condition and behavioral challenges. And the picture you see is a picture of a school, a specialized school for children with autism in the Northeast. They are rare. And being a parent of a child with autism during that time was really having autism as almost like a private matter. It was a family matter because people knew so little about it in the community and the resources are minimal. And for a condition that you're supposed to have by the age of 3 years, this is the way that autism was defined. We knew almost nothing about the infancy and toddlerhood period of these children. Well, autism today is something quite different. Something that was so rare, as you just heard from Dr. Rice, is now something that is more prevalent than all childhood cancers put together. It's something that impacts in excess of 3 million Americans out there. It's something that is so close to us that impacts us all. Thank God, the situation that we live in today is much more positive than years back. There were educational laws, as you heard. There are entitlements. There are resources. And community has truly embraced this as truly as a cultural concept. And outcomes are much more improved. And yet, we still have a long, long, long way to go. The societal burden of autism is a potentially devastating condition, is in excess of the $100 billion. But most importantly, as one of my colleagues who you're going to hear soon, the individual burden for families is incredible. $2.4 million, not only in terms of providing treatment for a severely disabled child with autism, but also in terms of loss of revenue and productivity for that family. There is a tremendous consensus in the world out there, beginning with the American Academy of Pediatrics, that early diagnosis and early intervention is absolutely critical if we are to optimize the outcome of our children. And yet, only 20% of children with a labeled autism during their school years is identified before the age of 3 years. And the median age of diagnosis still hovers around the age of 4 and 5, much after that period of neuroplasticity afforded by infancy and toddlerhood. Worse, when we talk about communities that are rural communities, impoverished communities, underserved communities, minorities, the age of diagnosis lags still. If we say that early diagnosis means early intervention means a better outcome, we ought to say that we are condemning whole sectors of our community to have the children with worse outcomes. So we have a real disparity of services in our community. But there are also, for some of us who have been in this field for a while, there are some really exciting things that have been happening for the past several years. For one, we are unveiling this mystery of what happens in the first years of life of children with autism, and much of it has to do with research that is being done with infant siblings of children with autism. Autism is the most strongly genetic of all complex developmental disorders. If I have a child with autism, and now my wife is pregnant, 1 in 5 of those children will also have autism. And another 1 in 5 will have shadows of it, or a subthreshold form of it. Now, by following these young children from the time that they're born, we're able now to see what happens between that shared genetic vulnerability and what happens later as this vulnerability is instantiated into symptoms. Something, by the way, that is not quite visible and cannot be reliably diagnosed until the age of 24 or 36 months. And so what we've been proposing is this notion that we need to take a new look at autism, maybe even redefine it. Symptoms are important for eligibility. Symptoms are important for creating advocacy groups. And certainly, as an advocate as well, as we go and we try to figure out how to advocate for interests of individuals and families impacted by autism, the symptomatology is absolutely critical. But I can tell you that genes don't code for symptoms. There are now several hundred genetic variants that have been associated with autism, and yet none of them has actually been connected causally to the symptoms that we use to define autism. Now, there is something about the genetic determinism that we have been living under in the past several years. It's a complex condition, hundreds of variants. Most of us carry unusual variants, and yet most of us don't have disabilities. So how do you go from what is a constitutional vulnerability, how is that instantiated and lead to, or it does not lead to symptoms? It's something that happens in between. Something that happens in the first 2 years of life. It's something called development. And my colleague Annette Camilla-Smith of developmental sciences would say, and I'm just here echoing her words, the key for neurodevelopmental disorders is development itself. But if so, we need to understand what happens in those early stages of life. And here is a proposal that I say to scientists and I say to some of our politicians in the state, because they don't realize the importance of early experiences in the life of children. The brain actually is shaped by those early experiences. The platform for brain development is that reciprocal interaction that happens between babies and their caregivers. And it's not something that impacts humans as well. It impacts primates in general. In fact, impacts animals that require the caregiving of another animal, usually the adult. So babies come into this world in this utter state of fragility. They come into this world with biases that put them in the direction of their caregiver. And those experiences that are happening there will push them in the direction of competence, will push them in the direction of learning, and will put them in the direction of navigating the demands of everyday life that our children have so much difficulty with. So we also have, going the wrong direction. So we have another form of determinism that we need to make sure that we combat. And it's brain determinism. When I was living in that residential unit, I thought that this is the brain, isn't it? It's intellectual disability, isn't it? But that's not so. Some of our research has shown that children actually learn about the world through others. And if they are not interacting with others, they will become socially disabled. Typically, the more withdrawn they are from the world of people, the more disabled they will become. We used to see the other direction. And so I'm quoting here another famous neuroscientist, Jolie Ledoux, who says that the brain not only determines who we're going to be, the brain becomes who we are. And therefore, we have to do something about this. So this is a 15-month-old little girl with autism who ignores me throughout the session. So I don't know how she is processing me, but one thing I know for sure, that the experiences that she has been having are very different. And therefore, the way that her brain is crystallizing into specialization, into new functions, ought to be different. So we had to try and measure that. And the behavior that we have been focusing on is something that we all do, looking into other people's eyes. So babies are born with that proclivity, so they come into this world, and from the first days of life, they prefer to look at people who look at them, rather than people who don't look at them. Primates do just the same. And by the time that they are 2 or 3 months of age, they fall in love with people's eyes in many different ways. What we had to do is to measure this falling in love. This is my colleague, Warren Jones, and that little typically developing 5-month-old is looking at a caregiver. And as she's engaging with that image that she is looking and listening to, we are measuring what she's doing 60 times a second. And when we started this work, we found out a few things. We found out that this is now a typically developing 6-month-old. Do you see that cross there? That cross there tells you where that 5-month-old is looking at, and she's looking at the eyes. Again, not only the window to people's soul, also the window to social neuroscience. But here is a 5-month-old whom we followed from birth, who developed autism. And look at the crosshair. She's everywhere, but she's also focusing a great deal on that mouth. Well, we had to study that, and intensively, because babies change from moment to moment to moment to moment. And what we did is that we followed those little children, the infant siblings of children with autism, from the age of 2 months all the way to the age of 24 months. And we also follow typically developing children. And this curve tells you what typically developing babies do and the percent of fixation that they vote to eyes. And so you see that from the age of 2, there is an increase, and then it's quite stable. And this is what happened to the babies who develop autism. They start way over there, and that is free fall for the first 24 months. So this is autism unfolding. Other things that we found out is that if we only look at the data in the first 6 months of life, we could actually classify the children with those data as the way that they became at the age of 24 and 36 months. We also could predict their level of social disability at 24 and 36 months using those data. Now, there are many things that we can do with this kind of new science. Our goal is to transform some of those new results into something that is going to begin to address our challenges in the community. If we want to deal with community disparities, we need universal screening. We have universal screening for a whole range of medical conditions, but we don't have it for autism. We need to implement that. For that, we need tools. For that, we need high-throughput tools. And we hope that we are able to transform those big labs into small-footprint devices that can be deployed where the children are seen. We have to be able to identify children early so that we can optimize their outcome. And we have to be able to significantly attenuate the level of burdens that comes from the absence of early intervention. Now, we also became very interested in one aspect of these findings. When we started in this field, we're following Kenner. And what Kenner said, as you heard from Dr. Rice, is that these children are born with this condition, in a way that they have been born without these mechanisms of socialization, those biases to the world of people. And if so, then they would not look into people's eyes, and it would be low and flat. That's not what we got. This is what we got. And what we realized is that, in fact, our children began even at a higher point than the typically developing children, and we have to understand what happened there. And this is now a theory. The theory is that all of our reflexes, the things that we bring into this world, our biases, they come, first of all, in the first weeks of life as reflexive. They are genetically determined, and they're also controlled by parts of our brain that are in the subcortical areas. So this is something that is done rapidly, and it's something that is done for survival. But soon enough, those reflexes are kidnapped, they are hijacked by completely different behaviors. Now, rather than being reflexive, is interactional, is reward-driven, and is controlled by cortical structures. Now, now we feel that we have outlined a point in time between 4 and maybe 20 weeks of life in which we can actually begin to understand this condition from a causative standpoint. Now, we ask ourselves the question, 1 in 5 has autism, 1 in 5 has something similar to autism, and 3 out of 5 do not have autism. These are the siblings. So we have to understand what happened to them. And we looked into those children who were siblings but did not have an eye decline in the first 6 months and had an unaffected outcome. Their outcome was basically typical development. And what you see here is their curves were very similar to the curves of typically developing children. Both the curves and what we call the first and second derivative, 2 words about that because this has biological reasons. But what happens to some of the children who actually had a decline in eye looking early on in their lives? Do you see, if you follow the black curve, is that somehow there was a course correction along that line. If you look at the first derivative, which basically means the change of eye fixation, you see that it crossed that 0 line at the age of 18 months. But the last graph is the one that really excited us. It's called the second derivative, and it tells you about rate of change. This is almost like a mathematical term that triggers your thought about a biological process that began at that point in time, and that happened at the age of 9 months. So there was a course correction in these children that left actually to an unaffected outcome. What does that mean? It means that now we have a natural point, a malleable point in the course of these children that maybe we can capitalize on so that they will not have the outcome as the siblings will become affected. Maybe we can do that in such a way that more and more children will be unaffected. Maybe we need to study the kind of genetic events that happen between those early periods of time. Because early social experiences don't only impact brain development, they also impact genetics. They impact gene expression. And we are now conducting studies of gene expression and methylation studies. And we also need to find out what has happened with our with brain development. And from here, quickly, we take a concept of brain developing as part of reciprocal social interaction and trying to address the fact that we could have the very best screener in the world. How difficult, how unethical this would be if we did not improve access to care. And we need to remember that studies in the past have really recommended in excess of 20 hours per week of expert help. This is something that in the state of Georgia is not going to ever help. Now, if we're talking about children basically having autism as the result of disruptions in normative development, then we need to focus early. We need to focus on every waking moment of the child, everyday activities. It needs to be parent-delivered because parents are actually spending all the time with the children and need to be community supported. So those dual goals go together, reducing age of diagnosis and improving access to care. And the way to do that, and this is our solution, the solution collectively of our field, is really focused on the 3 pillars of intervention. The primary care physicians who are there on the trenches in the medical home seeing every child, the early intervention providers who are mandated to provide those services, and the families. And the idea is to create tools like this tool originated by a colleague and collaborator, Amy Weatherby of Florida State University, the Autism Navigator, that allows us to speak the same language and to teach about the early signs of the condition so that we can perform treatments that our parents deliver happening every moment of the child. And here you see how that landscape may end up in the future. Over the years, I've seen individuals with autism that not only made incredible contributions to society, but they provided a very unique perspective, a perspective that was not, as it were, distracted by the perspectives of people. I've also learned that intellectual disability is not inevitable, that the social interaction is critical, and that relationships are critical. And so I think that what this foundation has taught us is to dream, and dream big, because that's something within our grasp. And the notion is that we want to really transform this field. We want to talk about autism from something that is a disability to something that is an issue of diversity. I hope to live a few more years, maybe than the next 5 years, that this is going to become something much more common in the way we speak about this condition in the community. Thank you very much.